Marcus Thompson was not an ordinary man, though he tried his best to live an ordinary life. Once a legend in the military world, Marcus had spent over 2 decades training some of the deadliest and most skilled soldiers on the planet. His name was spoken with reverence in elite circles, but outside those walls, few knew who he was. That's exactly how Marcus liked it. After years of living in the shadows, surviving on instincts and precision, he wanted nothing more than peace, and for a while, he found it. He settled down in a quiet town with Alina, his wife, who was the complete opposite of him. Warm, kind, and full of light. Where Marcus was reserved and calculated, Alina radiated joy and compassion. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, spending her days caring for others. Together, they built a simple yet happy life. Their home wasn't grand, but it was filled with laughter, shared meals, and dreams of traveling the world once they saved enough money. For Marcus, Alina wasn't just his partner. She was his anchor, the reason he chose to leave behind the chaos of his past. But fate has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. One fateful evening, everything changed. Alina had gone grocery shopping after work, picking up ingredients for dinner. She hummed softly to herself as she drove home, completely unaware that this night would mark the end of her peaceful existence. As she turned onto their street, blue and red lights flashed behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because being pulled over always made her nervous. The officer approached her window, his tone sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, do you know why I stopped you?" Alina shook her head, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "No, sir," she replied politely. "You've got a broken taillight. License and registration, please." It should have been a routine stop, something resolved in minutes, but things quickly spiraled out of control. When Alina reached for her purse to grab her documents, the officer barked, "Keep your hands where I can see them." Startled, she froze, unsure of what to do next. The situation escalated rapidly. Another officer arrived as backup, and soon, voices were raised, commands shouted, and panic set in. In the confusion, someone claimed Alina was reaching for a weapon, a claim she never had the chance to refute. Gunshots rang out, shattering the stillness of the evening. Neighbors rushed to their windows, horrified by what they saw. Alina lay slumped over the wheel, blood pooling around her. It took paramedics nearly 20 minutes to arrive. But by then, it was too late. Back at their home, Marcus sat waiting. Dinner grew cold on the table as worry gnawed at him. Why was Alina so late? He picked up his phone to call her, only to hear the news that would break him forever. As the gravity of the situation hit him, Marcus felt like the ground beneath him had crumbled. The woman he loved, the center of his universe, was gone, and taken from him in the most senseless, brutal way imaginable. Rage burned inside him, but it was tempered by disbelief. How could this happen? Who were these people who had stolen his future? And why did it feel like no one cared? For Marcus, this wasn't just about losing Alina. It was about confronting a system that seemed designed to crush people like them. This tragedy awakened something dormant within him. The same razor-sharp focus and determination that had earned him legendary status in the military. Though grief threatened to consume him, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Alina's death be in vain. Something had to change, and if no one else would fight for justice, then he would. The night of Alina's death replayed in Marcus's mind like a broken record, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. He couldn't shake the image of her car, lights still on, sitting abandoned on the side of the road where officers had left it after the shooting. The neighbors who witnessed the chaos described how quickly everything escalated, their voices trembling as they recounted the scene. But what haunted Marcus most was the official report he read days later, a cold, clinical document that painted his wife as a threat and justified the officer's actions under the guise of self-defense. According to the report, Alina had been uncooperative, her movements deemed suspicious. When she reached for her purse, the officers claimed they feared for their lives. Never mind that the purse contained nothing more dangerous than her wallet and keys. Never mind that Alina, a nurse who spent her days comforting sick children and elderly patients, posed no conceivable danger to anyone. To the officers at the scene, she was just another faceless suspect, someone whose life mattered less than their own safety. Marcus sat alone in his dimly lit living room, staring at the papers spread across the coffee table. His hands clenched into fists as he read phrases like officer-involved incident and necessary use of force. It felt surreal, almost laughable, if it weren't so devastating. These words were meant to sanitize what happened, to strip away the humanity of the person killed and reduce them to a statistic. But Marcus knew better. He understood how systems worked, how language could be twisted to protect those in power while punishing the powerless. As anger simmered beneath his grief, Marcus began piecing together what really happened. He spoke with witnesses, listened to their accounts, and pored over every scrap of evidence he could find. One neighbor mentioned hearing an officer shout aggressively before the shots were fired. Another said Alina looked scared but compliant, holding her hands up when told to do so. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged, one far removed from the sanitized version presented in the official report. What struck Marcus most was the casual indifference displayed by the police department afterward. There were no apologies, no expressions of remorse, not even a phone call offering condolences. Instead, there was silence, a deafening void where accountability should have been. Officers involved in the shooting returned to duty within days, acting as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. For them, this was just another day on the job. For Marcus, it was the end of everything he held dear. In moments of quiet reflection, Marcus wrestled with guilt. Had he failed Alina somehow? Should he have taught her how to handle situations like this, given his background? But deep down, he knew the fault didn't lie with her. She was an innocent woman caught in a system rigged against people like her, people who looked different, spoke differently, or simply didn't fit into the narrow mold society expected. This wasn't about mistakes. It was about prejudice, fear, and a lack of regard for human life. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus dug deeper. He requested dashcam footage from the officers' vehicles, hoping it might reveal inconsistencies in their story. What he discovered shocked him. The video showed Alina reaching slowly for her purse, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Yet the officers reacted as though she'd pulled a weapon. The disparity between reality and the narrative being pushed by authorities filled Marcus with both fury and resolve. For the first time since losing Alina, Marcus felt something other than despair: purpose. He realized that justice wouldn't come easily. It rarely did. But he also knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. If the system refused to hold itself accountable, then Marcus would take matters into his own hands, not through violence or vengeance, but through strategy, precision, and unwavering determination. After all, he hadn't trained the world's deadliest soldiers without learning a thing or two about dismantling enemies, even ones hidden behind badges and uniforms. The days following Alina's death were a blur of pain and anger for Marcus. He moved through life like a ghost, his mind consumed by memories of her laughter, her warmth, and the emptiness now left in her absence. Sleep evaded him. When it came, it brought nightmares, visions of that fateful night replayed over and over again, each time more vivid than the last. But as the initial shock began to fade, something shifted inside Marcus. The grief was still there, raw and unrelenting, but alongside it grew a fierce determination. This wasn't just about mourning anymore. It was about action. Marcus had always prided himself on his discipline, a trait honed during decades of military service. Even after leaving the battlefield behind, he carried that mindset with him into civilian life. Now, faced with the injustice of losing Alina, those instincts returned stronger than ever. He knew better than to act impulsively or out of blind rage. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't bring Alina back, and it certainly wouldn't fix the broken system that allowed this tragedy to happen. No, Marcus needed a plan, and if anyone could craft one, it was him. Sitting at the kitchen table late one night, Marcus spread out maps, documents, and notes he'd gathered about the police department involved in Elena's shooting. His eyes scanned the materials meticulously, searching for patterns, weaknesses, anything he could use. What he found disturbed him further. Several officers had histories of complaints filed against them for excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Yet none of these allegations had led to consequences. They were shielded by policies designed to protect their own, even when they crossed the line. As Marcus pieced together the puzzle, he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem. Officers who abused their power operated with near impunity, knowing the system would cover for them. For people like Elena, justice was a distant dream. The thought made Marcus's blood boil, but it also clarified his mission. This wasn't just about holding a few bad cops accountable. It was about exposing the rot at the core of the institution itself. But Marcus couldn't do it alone. As skilled and resourceful as he was, dismantling such a deeply entrenched system required help. Early the next morning, he reached out to old contacts from his military days. People who owed him favors or trusted his judgment implicitly. First, there was Rachel, a tech genius who could hack into secure databases without leaving a trace. Then came Jamal, a former sniper turned private investigator, whose ability to analyze details was unmatched. Lastly, he called up Sarah, a lawyer turned activist who specialized in civil rights cases. Each of them had walked away from their respective fields disillusioned, much like Marcus, but they all shared a desire to make a difference. When Marcus explained what happened to Elena and outlined his plan, the response was unanimous. They were in. Though hesitant at first, knowing the risks involved, they couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. Together, they formed a tight-knit team, united not by vengeance, but by a shared goal of accountability. Their strategy was simple yet ambitious. Gather irrefutable evidence of corruption within the police department, expose it to the public, and demand systemic change. For Marcus, this newfound alliance reignited a spark he hadn't felt in years. Planning operations, analyzing data, coordinating efforts, it reminded him of his days training elite operatives. Only this time, the stakes were personal. Every meeting, every discovery, every step forward fueled his resolve. He often found himself staring at a photograph of Elena, promising her silently that he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Yet, amidst the planning and strategizing, Marcus wrestled with doubt. Could they really take on such a powerful entity? Would the world care enough to listen? These questions lingered in the back of his mind, but he pushed them aside. Failure wasn't an option, not for Elena, not for the countless others who had suffered because of the same flawed system. If Marcus Thompson had learned anything in his life, it was that preparation and perseverance could overcome even the toughest odds. And so, with his team by his side, he prepared to fight, not just for justice, but for a future where no one else would have to endure the pain he felt. With his team assembled, Marcus wasted no time diving into the heart of their mission. Each member brought a unique skill set to the table, and together they worked like a well-oiled machine, quiet, efficient, and deadly serious about their goal. Rachel, the tech expert, took point on infiltrating police databases, sifting through mountains of data to uncover hidden truths. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as lines of code illuminated her screen, unlocking files that were supposed to remain buried forever. Jamal focused on surveillance, studying patrol patterns, officer behavior, and even digging into personal histories of those involved in Elena's case. Meanwhile, Sarah pored over legal documents, searching for loopholes or precedents that could be used to hold the department accountable. Marcus coordinated everything, his military precision guiding their efforts. He divided tasks strategically, ensuring everyone played to their strengths while maintaining constant communication. Late-night meetings became their norm, held in secret locations, a dimly lit garage here, an abandoned warehouse there. They communicated using encrypted devices, aware that exposing corruption meant risking retaliation. The stakes were high, but none of them flinched. This wasn't just a mission. It was a cause they believed in with every fiber of their being. Rachel soon struck gold, or rather, dirt. She uncovered a trove of internal memos detailing how complaints against officers were routinely dismissed without investigation. There were emails showing supervisors brushing off accusations of misconduct, sometimes even congratulating officers for keeping the peace despite clear evidence of wrongdoing. Even more damning were recordings of radio chatter from the night Elena was shot. The voices revealed panic, confusion, and a blatant disregard for protocol. One officer had shouted, "She's reaching for something," moments before gunshots rang out. A phrase later echoed verbatim in the official report, almost as if rehearsed. Jamal cross-referenced these findings with publicly available records, piecing together a disturbing pattern. The officers involved in Elena's shooting weren't anomalies. They were part of a culture of impunity. 2 of them had been involved in previous incidents where unarmed civilians were injured or killed, yet faced no consequences. Another had multiple complaints filed by minority residents alleging racial profiling. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were symptoms of a systemic disease rotting away at the core of law enforcement. Sarah translated this mountain of evidence into actionable legal strategies. She drafted detailed reports connecting the dots between individual cases and broader institutional failures. But she knew filing lawsuits wouldn't be enough. To create real change, they needed public pressure, a groundswell of outrage that couldn't be ignored. That's when Marcus proposed leaking the information to trusted journalists. "We need someone who can tell Elena's story," he said during one of their late-night sessions. "Not just the facts, but what it means, who she was, what we lost." The team agreed, and Rachel carefully curated a package of documents, videos, and audio clips, encrypting them to protect their source. They reached out anonymously to investigative reporters known for tackling sensitive topics, providing just enough information to pique interest without revealing their identities. Within days, news outlets began picking up the story. Headlines blared phrases like "pattern of abuse uncovered" and "victims speak out against police brutality." The tide was turning, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. As momentum grew, Marcus turned his attention to another critical piece of the puzzle, rallying the community. He and Sarah attended town hall meetings disguised as concerned citizens, subtly steering conversations toward accountability and reform. Jamal scouted local activists and grassroots organizations, forging alliances that amplified their message. Together, they planned protests, not violent demonstrations, but peaceful gatherings designed to send a clear message. Justice for Elena wasn't just about one woman. It was about all the lives shattered by unchecked power. Through it all, Marcus carried Elena's memory close to his heart. Every document uncovered, every conversation sparked, every plan executed was done with her in mind. He often whispered to himself, "This is for you, love. I won't let them forget your name." And though grief still lingered, it now mingled with hope, a fragile but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, they could win. As the evidence against the police department mounted, Marcus and his team knew they had to strike while the iron was hot. The leaks to journalists had already ignited a firestorm of public outrage, but Marcus understood that exposing corruption wasn't enough. They needed to make sure the pressure didn't fizzle out. It had to grow until it forced action. And so, the team shifted gears, focusing on turning whispers of scandal into an undeniable roar. Rachel worked tirelessly behind her laptop, releasing new pieces of information in carefully timed intervals. Each revelation hit like a bombshell. Bodycam footage showing officers laughing after roughing up a teenager during an arrest. Text messages between supervisors joking about teaching lessons to troublemakers. Internal memos detailing how complaints were systematically buried. Every piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of a system designed not to protect, but to oppress. The media couldn't get enough, running story after story that kept the issue front and center. But Marcus knew the press alone wouldn't be enough. Public opinion was powerful, but it needed fuel. Real people standing up and demanding change. That's where Sarah stepped in. With her background in law and activism, she helped organize rallies and demonstrations across the city. Flyers appeared overnight on lampposts and bulletin boards, calling for justice, not just for Alina, but for every victim of police misconduct. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForAlina and #AccountabilityNow, spreading their message far beyond the small town where the tragedy occurred. The first protest drew hundreds, a mix of locals, activists, and even some disillusioned former officers who had grown tired of the toxic culture within their ranks. Marcus attended, blending into the crowd despite his towering presence. He listened as speakers shared stories of loved ones, lost or lives ruined by unchecked power. One woman recounted how her son was beaten during a routine traffic stop, simply because he questioned why he'd been pulled over. Another spoke through tears about her brother, killed when officers mistook his cell phone for a weapon. Each story added weight to the movement, making it impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. While the protests gained momentum, Jamal focused on targeting key figures within the police department. Using surveillance footage and leaked documents, he identified individuals most responsible for perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Then, under the cover of darkness, Marcus paid them visits, not to threaten, but to remind them they weren't untouchable. Dressed in plain clothes, he knocked on doors late at night, introducing himself only as a concerned citizen. His reputation preceded him, and rumors spread quickly among officers about the mysterious man asking pointed questions and leaving cryptic warnings. Some laughed it off, dismissing him as harmless. Others grew visibly uneasy, realizing someone was watching and waiting. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure the legal side of their campaign stayed airtight. She drafted petitions demanding independent investigations into the department's practices and submitted them to local officials. When those fell on deaf ears, she took the fight higher, appealing directly to state representatives and civil rights organizations. Her persistence paid off when a prominent advocacy group agreed to back their cause, lending credibility and resources to the movement. Through it all, Marcus remained the quiet architect of the operation, guiding each step with precision. He never sought the spotlight, preferring instead to let the facts speak for themselves. But privately, he allowed himself moments of reflection, imagining how proud Alina would have been of what they'd accomplished. She always believed in fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Now her spirit lived on in every chant, every sign, every person brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." By the time the city council called for an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis, the entire community was buzzing. Protesters gathered outside the building, holding candles and photos of victims. Reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the moment history might finally tilt toward justice. Inside, officials squirmed under the weight of public scrutiny, knowing they could no longer ignore the storm brewing around them. For Marcus and his team, it was proof that their efforts were working. The system was beginning to crack, and once it did, there would be no putting it back together again. The emergency city council meeting marked a turning point in the fight for justice, though Marcus knew the battle was far from over. The room buzzed with tension as officials sat stiffly at the head table, their faces a mix of discomfort and defensiveness. Outside, the crowd chanted loudly, their voices echoing through the halls. No more lies. No more fear. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, while cameras rolled, capturing every awkward glance and fumbled response from the council members. It was clear they were unprepared for the storm they now faced. Inside, Sarah took center stage. Armed with stacks of documents, charts, and irrefutable evidence, she presented her case with calm authority. Her words were measured but piercing, each sentence backed by hard data that left no room for denial. She highlighted the patterns of misconduct, showing how complaints against officers were routinely ignored or buried. She pointed out connections between specific individuals involved in Alina's shooting and previous incidents of excessive force. Most damning of all, she revealed internal communications where supervisors casually dismissed allegations of abuse, sometimes even praising officers for their actions. By the time she finished speaking, the council members looked visibly shaken. But Marcus wasn't done yet. While Sarah handled the public-facing side of things, he orchestrated quieter, subtler moves designed to rattle those in power. Late one night, anonymous packages began arriving on the doorsteps of key figures within the police department and beyond. Inside were copies of incriminating documents along with handwritten notes reminding recipients that the truth always finds its way into the light. One note read simply, "You can't outrun what you've done." Though unsigned, everyone knew who it came from. Whispers spread among officers about Marcus Thompson, the man who trained elite soldiers, the man who refused to back down. Fear crept into their ranks, gnawing at their confidence. Jamal played his part too, using surveillance footage and leaked audio clips to expose contradictions in official statements. He shared snippets online, carefully edited to highlight discrepancies between what officers claimed happened and what actually occurred. In one clip, an officer could be heard shouting, "She's reaching for something," mere seconds before gunshots rang out. Yet the bodycam footage showed Alina's hands clearly visible above the steering wheel. The video went viral overnight, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Comment sections flooded with calls for accountability, hashtags trending worldwide. Rachel kept the pressure on digitally, releasing new pieces of evidence, just as the public started to lose steam. Each revelation reignited interest, ensuring the story remained front-page news. Local journalists followed her trail of breadcrumbs, uncovering additional layers of corruption within the department. A particularly explosive report revealed how certain officers received promotions despite repeated complaints, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the community. Even longtime supporters of law enforcement began questioning whether the system was truly broken beyond repair. Meanwhile, protests continued to grow, drawing national attention. Activists from neighboring cities joined forces, organizing marches that shut down major streets and demanded immediate action. Signs bearing Alina's name became symbols of resilience, carried proudly by demonstrators young and old. Marcus attended many of these events, standing quietly at the edges of the crowd. He didn't speak publicly, not because he lacked courage, but because he wanted the focus to remain on the movement, not on him. Still, his presence was felt. People whispered about the man behind the scenes, the strategist pulling strings with precision and purpose. As the weeks passed, cracks began forming within the police department itself. Officers who once stood united started turning on each other, some desperate to distance themselves from scandal. Anonymous tips poured in, pointing fingers at colleagues or superiors. Others resigned outright, unable to bear the weight of scrutiny any longer. Public trust eroded rapidly, leaving the department scrambling to regain control. But every attempt fell flat under the weight of mounting evidence. For Marcus, this phase of the campaign was both exhausting and exhilarating. Exhausting because the fight never seemed to end. Exhilarating because he could see progress unfolding before his eyes. Every protest, every headline, every resignation brought them closer to their goal. Yet even as victories piled up, he reminded himself why they were fighting in the first place. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Justice for Alina, yes, but also for everyone who had suffered at the hands of unchecked power. The announcement of an independent investigation sent shockwaves through the community, but Marcus knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Investigations, no matter how well-intentioned, often ended with little more than empty promises and half-hearted reforms. Still, this was progress, a crack in the wall that had stood unshaken for so long. For Marcus and his team, it meant doubling down on their efforts to ensure the process wasn't just another whitewash. Sarah took charge of monitoring the investigation closely, attending every public hearing and filing motions to demand transparency. She worked tirelessly to hold officials accountable, ensuring they followed through on their promises. Meanwhile, Rachel continued her digital campaign, releasing new evidence whenever momentum seemed to slow. Each revelation kept the pressure on, reminding everyone involved that the eyes of the nation were watching. Jimmel focused on gathering testimonies from former officers willing to speak out about systemic issues within the department. Their voices added weight to the movement, showing that even those inside the system recognized its flaws. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to bear fruit. Officers implicated in past abuses were suspended pending review, while others faced formal charges. Those directly involved in Alina's shooting found themselves at the center of criminal proceedings, their actions scrutinized under a microscope. The prosecutor assigned to the case described it as one of the most damning examples of misconduct he'd ever seen, a statement that brought a grim sense of satisfaction to Marcus. But justice, as Marcus had learned, was never straightforward. Courtroom battles dragged on, with defense attorneys arguing that the officers acted in accordance with protocol and claiming they genuinely feared for their lives. Witnesses were intimidated, documents mysteriously disappeared, and delays became commonplace. It was frustrating, maddening even, but Marcus refused to let it break him. Instead, he channeled his frustration into action, rallying supporters to keep the pressure on. Protests continued outside courthouses, demanding fairness and accountability. Activists held vigils, keeping Alina's memory alive and refusing to let her story fade into obscurity. Amidst the legal battles, something remarkable happened. The movement grew beyond what anyone could have anticipated. What started as a local outcry transformed into a nationwide reckoning. Communities across the country began organizing similar campaigns, inspired by Alina's story and the relentless pursuit of justice, led by Marcus and his team. Hashtags like #JusticeForAlina trended repeatedly, sparking conversations about policing, accountability, and systemic racism. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at reforming police practices, citing the case as a catalyst for change. For Marcus, these developments were bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a flicker of hope that Alina's death might lead to meaningful reform, sparing others from similar tragedies. On the other hand, nothing could fill the void she left behind. He still woke up each morning expecting to see her smile, hear her laughter, feel her warmth, and each time, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. Grief lingered, sharp and unrelenting, but it now mingled with purpose. Every step forward was a tribute to her, a way to honor the woman who had been his everything. Finally, after months of hearings, testimonies, and deliberations, verdicts were handed down. The officers involved in Alina's shooting were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison terms. While some argued the sentences weren't harsh enough, Marcus saw them for what they were, a rare instance of accountability in a system built to resist it. The conviction sent a powerful message that even those sworn to protect and serve could not act without consequence. In the aftermath, Marcus stood quietly at Alina's graveside, holding a single rose. "We did it," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "They can't ignore us anymore." But as tears streamed down his face, he also acknowledged the truth. No verdict could bring her back. No amount of reform could erase the pain of losing her. Yet, in fighting for justice, Marcus had found a way to keep her spirit alive, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved better than the broken system they inherited. The road ahead would still be long, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But Marcus knew one thing for certain. The fight didn't end here. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and demand change, Alina's legacy would continue to inspire generations to come. In the months following the convictions, Marcus stepped back from the public eye. He declined interviews, avoided cameras, and turned down offers to speak at rallies or write op-eds. For him, this fight had never been about fame or recognition. It was about Alina. And now that justice had been served, however imperfectly, he wanted nothing more than to honor her memory in quieter ways. He poured his energy into creating a foundation in Alina's name, dedicated to supporting families impacted by police violence and advocating for systemic reform. The foundation offered free legal assistance to victims' families, funded scholarships for young activists pursuing careers in social justice, and organized workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between communities and law enforcement. It wasn't just about addressing past wrongs. It was about building a future where such tragedies could be prevented. Every program, every initiative bore Elena's imprint, her compassion, her belief in humanity's capacity for change. Marcus also began mentoring young people who reminded him of himself at their age. Determined, idealistic, but often unsure of how to channel their anger into action. He taught them the importance of discipline, strategy, and resilience, not through lectures, but through shared experiences. Together, they organized community cleanups, held voter registration drives, and participated in peaceful protests. Slowly but surely, Marcus saw a new generation rising, one that refused to accept the status quo and was willing to work tirelessly to create something better. Though he found purpose in these efforts, grief remained a constant companion. There were days when the weight of Elena's absence felt unbearable, when even the simplest tasks seemed insurmountable. On those days, Marcus would visit the small garden he planted in her memory, a patch of earth filled with her favorite flowers. Sitting there, surrounded by beauty she would have loved, he allowed himself to cry, to remember, to mourn. But he also reminded himself of what they'd achieved together, not just the convictions, but the movement they'd sparked. Elena's death hadn't been in vain. Her story had become a beacon of hope for countless others. As time passed, Marcus noticed subtle changes within the town and beyond. Conversations about policing and accountability became less taboo, more open. Community leaders worked alongside officers to rebuild trust, implementing reforms inspired by the lessons learned during the investigation. Training programs emphasize de-escalation over force, transparency over secrecy. While progress was slow, it was undeniable. People were beginning to believe that change was possible, and that belief was powerful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood on the porch of the home he and Elena had once shared. In his hand, he held a letter from a young woman whose brother had been killed by police years earlier. She wrote to thank him, not just for the work he'd done, but for giving her the courage to keep fighting. "Because of you," she said, "I know my brother's life mattered too." Tears welled in Marcus's eyes as he folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. It was moments like these that reminded him why he kept going. This wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt invisible, voiceless, powerless. Through his actions, Marcus had shown them that their pain mattered, that their voices could make a difference. As night fell, Marcus looked up at the stars, imagining Elena watching over him. He smiled softly, whispering, "We did good, love. Real good." Then, taking a deep breath, he turned back toward the house, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The road ahead would still be challenging, but Marcus knew he wouldn't walk it alone. He carried Elena's light with him, guiding him forward, inspiring him to continue the fight. For justice, for peace, for a world where everyone could live without fear.